Madam Chair, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
My apologies. Calling the roll for the special joint meeting of the Public Safety Committee and the Board of Police Commissioners. For the Public Safety Committee, Councilmember Rodriguez,
Here.
Councilmember Alfaro,
Present.
Councilmember Buscaino is absent. Councilmember De Leon,
Here.
Councilmember Harris Dawson is absent. 3 members present. We have a quorum for the Public Safety Committee. Calling the roll for the Board of Police Commissioners, President Eileen Decker,
Present.
Vice President William Briggs,
Here.
Commissioner Dale Bonner,
Here.
Commissioner Maria Lou Calanche,
Here.
Commissioner Steve Sabaroff.
Here.
5 out of 5 members present. You have a quorum for the Board of Police Commissioners.
Councilmember Rodriguez, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
You know, it wouldn't have worked if I actually unmuted myself, right? So let me start again. First of all, I want to thank the Board of Police Commissioners for making yourselves available. You give a great deal of service to the City of Los Angeles in your roles, dedicate a lot of your free time in service to the people of Los Angeles. And so I want to thank you for availing yourselves to be part of this special meeting today. I also want to thank Chief Moore for joining us to be part of this special conversation, as well as our 2 presenters, Akila Shirls and Joshua Young, who are here to present. But first, I wanted to start off by saying thank you all so much for making yourselves available to make this meeting happen today. We will have to begin with accepting public comment, and I will go ahead and commence that process so that we can get into the meat of the conversation that we have before us today. So, Madam Clerk, if you'd please announce the call-in information for members of the public who wish to speak on today's agenda item.
Members of the public who would like to offer public comment on the item listed on the agenda should call 1-669-254-5252 and use meeting ID number 161-586-7607, and then press the number sign. Press the number sign again when prompted for participant ID. Once admitted into the meeting, press *9 to request to speak.
Thank you. So just to reiterate for members of the public that are calling to provide public comment, today we will be taking up to 30 minutes of public comment. Because this is a special meeting, we will not be taking general public comment. So you have 1 minute to speak on item number 1 on today's agenda. And so with that, we'll go ahead and start.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 7742, please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller, please state your name, and you've got 1 minute.
Yes, this is Dolores, and I'm responding with Monica Rodriguez's statement that this is to be an historical meeting. I agree, a historical blunder where we are being governed by the most ignorant of the species and seems to think that she has some kind of special enlightenment. She does not. Do not do to our policing and public safety what has been done to solving our homeless problem. Politicizing our police in the same manner homelessness has brought horrid results. The majority of our so-called leaders can't find their way out of a paper bag. Put down the reimagining crack pipe and look to reasonable people for answers and results. Ridiculous that we have 1 minute on this historical meeting. Your presenter today, Akila Shirls, is a blatant racist and race baiter. He should not have a place at the table as a presenter. We have a councilwoman who believes burning, looting, and murdering was a great thing with no regard to the hundreds of lives lost, billions of dollars
Thank you.
lost.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 1502, please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller, please state your name, and you have 1 minute.
Again, caller with the last 4 digits, 1502. Please press *6.
Hello? Hi, caller. Hi, please state your name, and you have 1 minute for item 1 on today's agenda.
Hi, my name's Zoila Green. I just want to know how a joint police commission and public safety meeting does not discuss anything that has to do with actual public safety. All these minds at today's meeting, but no discussion of public safety? Unbelievable. Your continued deflection of actual public safety issues is repulsive. Here's an actual public safety issue. Why isn't there a discussion about the fact that both sworn and non-sworn staff are either retiring or resigning in record numbers? How is this continued attrition of staff going to impact public safety? I highly doubt these job openings will be filled as a result of budget cuts and limited revenue because of COVID and vilification of LAPD. Because of this, both Public Safety Committee and Police Commission facilitated the unintended consequence of LAPD creating fewer job opportunities to community it serves, including people of color, as a large percentage of support staff are in fact people of color. I doubt LAPD will fill the hordes of civilian job vacancies because of budget cuts and because of the fact that you encourage anti-police rhetoric while trying to please these anti-police callers.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 8436. Please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name, and you have 1 minute for item 1.
Again, caller with the last 4 digits, 8436. Please press *6 to unmute.
Okay,
Michael.
well,
Hi, can you please state
Sorry
your
about
name,
that.
and you have 1 minute.
Mike, and this is incredible. Monica Rodriguez is a disgrace to the city and fails to protect her constituents. She endorses a BLM, a self-admitted Marxist organization. She says she wants public safety, yet she wants to defund the police. That's an oxymoron to me. The only people that need to be afraid of the police are criminals or people that resist authority. We need to teach respect for authority and not handcuff authority. This city has gone to hell in a handbasket. Thank you very much.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 5436. Please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name, and you have 1 minute for item 1.
Again, caller with the last 4 digits, 5436. Please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Please state your name, and you have 1 minute for item 1 on today's agenda.
Yeah, I'm just calling to say that this joint committee meeting is full of people who should not be anywhere near public safety. Joe Buscaino, pro-child abuse, the only member of the city council to vote against a settlement for children abused in an LAPD summer camp. Chief Michael Moore whining about the city attorney's decision not to bring charges against protesters who were arrested under totally false pretenses. There was a video showing LAPD was going to arrest everybody protesting at Echo Park Lake from 8 in the morning. And Chief Moore is whining about that decision online. Disgusting abuse of power by him. And then there's Mitch O'Farrell, who likes to torture and torment unhoused people and has made Echo Park Lake less safe because now first responders can't even get into the park because of his stupid fence that he put up. So I don't know why these people are involved in any kind of public safety.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 7543. Please press *6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name, and you have 1 minute for public comment on item 1.
Again, caller with the last 4 digits, 754. There you go.
Hi, caller.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My
please
name is
state your
Lionel
name.
Mares. My name is Lionel Mares. I'm City 6. I'm calling on item 1. I major in criminology and criminal justice at California State University and public administration. And my understanding is that public safety, in my opinion, requires all sides, everyone in the community, not just the police, but everyone, social workers, the community residents, to start taking care of themselves and start to work together as one rather than fragmented tribalist society. We have to work together to solve crime, to prevent crime, to help those who are suffering economically. Some people resort to crime because they have no economic means and they don't know they learned this. And sociology is learned behavior. So they learn in an environment where crime is acceptable according to sociologists. And we must provide economic opportunities in order to lessen crime in our community, especially low-income areas.
Thank you.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 4407. Please press star 6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name. You have 1 minute for item 1 on today's agenda.
Samantha Jones, item 1, please. Just calling because the police, equitable policing, I hope whatever decisions you make today that it doesn't weaken police as it is, because we're in a really scary time right now with just crime up and shootings and homicides. So whatever decisions you're making today, I hope it doesn't further weaken our police. I support the police. We need more police. And I think the police is already a leading in the country. You know, LAPD is very diverse as it is. You know, you got women, men, black, brown, Asian, white, everything. And so I think we're already a good representation of the people that live here in LA. And so we're just concerned with the safety, and we want our children protected, our families protected, our neighborhoods protected, our streets protected. So please do not weaken police in any way in the name of Black Lives Matter or social justice. Thank you.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 2992. Please press star 6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name. You have 1 minute for item 1 on today's agenda.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you. I would like to ask Council Member Rodriguez to please stop pandering to Black Lives Matter and their entire movement. Our city is a lot less safe. Drug addicts and violent crime is just taken over our city, and you need to stop mixing racial injustice and racism and civil rights with our public safety, because the average citizen is people, everyday people, and especially brown and black communities are really suffering, and they aren't safe. So you need to focus on taking care of your constituents, on the majority of them, and stop mixing racial issues with the police. LAPD is an amazing.
Thank you.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 0429. Please press star 6 to unmute.
Hi, caller. Please state your name. You have 1 minute for item 1 on today's agenda.
Okay. BJ Johnson. Hi there. I just want to applaud Aqeela Sherrills and the work he's doing to change policing here in America to be more equitable and more progressive in terms of how it supports our communities. Black Lives Matter, defund the police, end police associations, fire Chief Moore, and fully understand that cops have never provided for public safety, but instead control and suppress. We as a people want transformative solutions which require resources and defunding the police. Let's make that happen, be critical leaders, and let's support Aqeela Sherrills in his transformative work rather than support fallacies and short-sighted ideas. We can be a better society. We can transform things to make them better, including policing, and that will require hard changes. Black Lives Matter, defund the police, end police associations, and fire Chief Moore. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Caller with the last 4 digits, 4578. Please press star 6 to unmute. Again, caller with the last 4 digits, 4578. Please press star 6 to unmute.
No.
Okay. I am not hearing caller with the last 4 digits. Oh, here we go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Caller, please state your name.
Hi.
You've got 1 minute.
Yeah, hi. My name is Hamid Khan with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and LACAN, Los Angeles Community Action Network. Many times these community-based safety programs have been presented, but the problem with that is that we cannot have community-based public safety unless the infrastructure that surrounds it, that causes deep harm, remains in place. And by that infrastructure, I mean the massive expansion of fusion centers, massive surveillance programs, multi-jurisdictional operations. And what we constantly see at the end of the day is that while people are making an honest effort, but yet at the same time, the tactical operations and the way these systems are set up, that we see some of the most vulnerable community members being impacted. People who are involved in informal economy, people who are unhoused, people who are mentally ill. So the point here is that we can keep on praising these programs, but yet at the same time, under the surface and operationally the way these jurisdictions are set up, we end up and giving.
Okay, that concludes public comment for today's meeting. I want to thank you all for participating. And colleagues, I just want to again thank you all for joining in this special, making yourselves available for this special meeting today to discuss community-based policing and community-based public safety. We will hear first from Akila Charles, who will discuss the work that he's leading in the city of Newark. And as a member of an effort at the National League of Cities, I've had the pleasure of also speaking with Mayor Baraka up in the city of Newark and learning more about the work that you all are engaged in over there. And I think we're in a moment in time that presents us all with an opportunity to really hear and learn from the other efforts that are being engaged in cities across America, so that we can together identify the best practice or the next practice to implement here in Los Angeles and identify where we can continue to refine and improve our efforts to achieve greater public safety outcomes here in the city of Los Angeles. I also want to thank Joshua Young from the Center of Policing Equity, who has also joined us here today. Because again, as we have these conversations, and it's important, and the reason why we've asked the Board of Police Commissioners to join us is that because as policymakers, both from an oversight of the police department and as policymakers here on the city, for the city of Los Angeles that oversees the budgetary process, I think it's important for us to have a conversation amongst one another, for us to hear the efforts that are being deployed in other cities, to learn from it, and to identify where we perhaps would evolve in our practice here in Los Angeles. And so that is the purpose of this meeting, and making sure that together as policymaking bodies, that we're all hearing the same information in the presence of one another to ask those questions. And again, I want to thank Chief Moore for being here as well and making himself available to be part of this conversation. But before we turn it over to our esteemed guests, I'd like to first provide an opportunity to our President of the Board of Police Commissioners, Ms. Eileen Decker.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Rodriguez. On behalf of all the members of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners, thank you for your gracious invitation to hold a joint meeting together, both between the Public Safety Committee and the Board of Police Commissioners. It's indeed our pleasure to be with you today and to be with all the esteemed members of the Los Angeles City Council's Public Safety Committee. It is nice to see you all again, but I do hope one day soon we can meet in person. I do want to thank the staff members and our executive director, Mr. Tiefenk, who dedicated their time to organizing this meeting today. Council members, I do believe you know all of my fellow commissioners. You have met with them and certainly you have confirmed their appointments to the Board of Police Commissioners, but I thought I would very briefly introduce each of them, and I will say any introduction of them highlighting some of their experiences will be deficient in describing them, their capabilities, their dedication to the city, and to the board. First, Commissioner William Briggs II. He is the Vice President of the Commission. He is a native Angelino. He was born and raised in South LA. He is an attorney here in Los Angeles, and he previously served as a city commissioner for Lacers, as well as a trustee on the Sierra Canyon School Board of Directors. But he's especially known for all of his pro bono legal services to the Alliance for Children's Rights. Commissioner Dale Bonner is the executive chairman of Plenary Concessions, a leading investor and developer of public infrastructure. He previously served as California's Secretary of Business, Transportation, and Housing, and as secretary, he oversaw more than 7,000 sworn officers at California Highway Patrol. He also previously served on another city commission, the city's Ethics Commission. Commissioner Calanche, founder and executive director of Legacy LA, a youth development organization aimed at providing at-risk youth living in the Ramona Gardens community of Boyle Heights with the tools and resources needed to help them fulfill their potential. Previously, she was a political science professor at East Los Angeles Community College and served as a council deputy for former Los Angeles City Council member Richard Alatorre. She also has served on a number of community nonprofit boards and city commissions, including at El Pueblo and the city's Housing Authority. And last but not least, but last in alphabetical order only, Commissioner Steve Soberoff. He has served on the commission since 2013. He's been its president twice and its vice president. This is in addition to his many other contributions to our city as president of the Los Angeles Rec and Parks Commission, as well as a senior advisor to Mayor Richard Reardon, among his many other accomplishments. As you can see, council members, it's indeed a pleasure to serve with each of these colleagues, each of whom have a distinguished career of service to our city. I previously acknowledged Mr. Tiefenk, the executive director of our commission, with whom none of our work would get done. We could never express enough gratitude to him. And of course, as the councilwoman previously recognized, the chief of police, Chief Michael Moore, our 57th police chief, is here. Council members and commissioners and Chief Moore, I've been advised by our unofficial historian, Mr. Tiefenk, that the commission and the Public Safety Committee have not met together since the days of the consent decree. Obviously, that has been far too long. And I hope that this meeting is the start of more regular meetings. It is important not just for us to have conversations amongst ourselves or with each other, but it is important, as the councilwoman recognized, important for the residents of our city to see and to know that we have a collaborative operating procedure in our city, that we work collaboratively towards the betterment of our city, and that in our mutual efforts, we seek to ensure effective public safety policies and practices for all Angelinos throughout this very large and grand city. So thank you, Councilwoman Rodriguez, for leading this effort. I know my fellow commissioners and I look forward to today's meeting as a symbol of our collective desire to think forward on public safety, to continue our collaborative efforts together. And to our two presenters, thank you for accepting our invitation. We very much look forward to hearing your remarks today. Thank you, Councilwoman.
Thank you so much, President Decker. And I also want to take a moment. My colleagues, Mr. Buscaino has joined our meeting. Thank you, Mr. Buscaino. And of course, Mr. O'Farrell and Mr. De Leon, as Ms. Decker indicated, it's been quite a long time since these two bodies have convened. And given this moment in history, I think it's apropos that we've again come together so that we can continue to identify areas of opportunity for us to discover perhaps new models that we could be implementing here in Los Angeles so that we can achieve what is mutually what we endeavor to do, and that's to have a safer city in Los Angeles, and to ensure that we are rightfully funding and sourcing resources to communities in a manner that actually respects and honors them. And so today I'd like to begin with an introduction of someone who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the course of several years in a variety of capacities. But again, colleagues, the item on today's agenda is a discussion on community-based public safety, which include presentations from Akila Shirls and Mr. Young from the Center for Policing Equity. And to begin, we'll start with Akila. And just to give a very brief introduction, Akila Shirls was born in the Jordan Downs housing projects of Watts and came of age in the mid-1980s when gang violence in Los Angeles was headed into its most deadly period. In 1992, Shirls and his brother successfully brought rival gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, together to sign a historic peace treaty in Watts. He founded the Reverence Movement to help others talk about their emotional wounds and co-founded the Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice Initiative, which has been prominent in California's justice reform movement. Akila came originally to Newark, New Jersey, and the work that he is leading in today at the invitation of Mayor Baraka to create a small pilot project to address the city's violence at a time when Newark's police department was being investigated by the federal government for its troubling patterns of the use of excessive force. He currently serves as the executive director of Community-Based Public Safety Association and director of Newark Community Street Team. Akila, the floor is yours. After the presentation, after you share with my colleagues the work that you're leading in Newark, we will offer an opportunity for questions. So I turn it over.
Madam Chair, if I may, I just got to give lots of love to this man you're about to hear from. Akila, love you, appreciate you, honor you. You've done great work in Watts, and I'm also talking to Mayor Baraka in New York, who praises you with our affiliation with National League of Cities. Madam Chair, thank you. Had to just say it. Love you, Akila. Appreciate you.
Love you too, brother. Thank you so much, Councilwoman, for the opportunity to talk about community-based public safety work, and especially at this inflection point that we're in, nationally in terms of public safety. Thank you so much to the Police Commission, to the Public Safety Committee members, and of course to my Councilman Joe. Thank you so much, brother, for all of the great work that you do in the city. In terms of supporting this work. You've been a champion, for us from day one. As the Councilwoman shared, I grew up in the Jordan Downs housing projects and participated in what many social justice activists call the longest running war in the history of this country, which has been urban street gang wars. And I don't have to even go through the details, but in LA County alone, between 1983 and 2003, we had over 20,000 gang-related deaths in LA. And it doesn't include those who have been permanently maimed or incarcerated for the rest of their life behind their participation. Both the perpetrators and the victims, the kids and the young adults, all suffer from traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, vicarious trauma. But because we still live in a system that's built on systemic racism and implicit bias, in most cases, the cries of these individuals fall on deaf ears. And so for years, it's been our strategy to really humanize the people behind this label that we call gangs, right? And help to sensitize the public to the cry and to the plight, of these individuals in the community, right? I co-founded American with Hall of Fame football great Jim Brown in 1989, which preceded our work in terms of organizing the peace treaty in the neighborhood that literally changed the quality of life in the community. With the peace treaty, it launched our work to multiple cities. So before the advent of social media, American was the cure violence of our time. I lived on the road for close to 4 years in different cities, developing community-based public safety strategies, helping to reduce violence and crime in those respective cities. And so I bring all of that to bear on the current work that I do. In 2003, my oldest son, Terrell, was home on winter break from Humboldt State University. The oldest of my 8 children, the proudest day in my life, taking this kid to school. He came home from winter break, went to a party with a group of friends in an affluent black neighborhood on the west side of LA, and was shot to death at the party. 15 years later, Terrell's case is still a cold case. And so, you know, and it's challenging, right? But I tell you that today I do this work as an ode to him, to ensure that his death is not in vain, and also to lift up his children, Heavenly and Devin, to help them to better understand that you know, things happen, but we also have a responsibility to continue to invest in real transformative change in communities. Now, when most people hear public safety, they think police, right? This singular view has unfairly put the responsibility of safety, proactive and reactive, in the hands of a single entity, right? Public safety is far too complex and ubiquitous to deploy a single strategy or a single agency to overcome a lot of the violence that we've experienced in the community. Reimagining public safety is not just about reinvesting money in procedural justice training and de-escalation strategies for cops. It should also be about expanding complementary strategies, community-based solutions that rely less on police as a single point of contact, especially in communities with strained and often compromised relationships between the community and law enforcement. As a direct result of systemic racism and implicit bias, like, safety in this country takes on a whole different meaning in different communities. Many Black and brown communities equate police with fear, excessive force, surveillance, and sustained stress. In white affluent communities, historically, they've had a different experience with police. You know, so people tend to view and equate police with safety, security, and well-being. You know, culture and identity are heavily influenced by language. So understanding the power of language, I'm really endeavoring to present a new narrative that safety is not just the absence of violence and crime, that it's also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. So safety is a shared strategy, and that we have to redefine public safety for everyone, right? And introduce a complementary public safety initiative, you know, like community-based public safety. We used to call this thing gang intervention, street outreach, crisis intervention work. But those practitioners who have been thought leaders in this work for 25, close to 30 years, got together and we decided that we were going to define this work in this field for ourselves. Because it's not just high-risk intervention and assertive outreach and victims advocacy. All of these systems are working together, and so we call it community-based public safety because it is evidence-based, it's practice-based, it incorporates technology to effectively reduce violence and crime in respective neighborhoods. And this has helped to create, you know, safety in some of the toughest neighborhoods across the country. And so in 2015, I was tapped by Mayor Ras J. Baraka to build out the City of Newark's community-based public safety initiative, the Newark Community Street Team. That year, in 2015 in Newark, the city had triple-digit numbers in homicides, 105 homicides in 2015. And Newark had been on the top 10 most violent city list for almost 50 consecutive years when we started our work. The mayor established the Safer Newark Council as a coordinating body for public safety strategies in the city and included community-based organizations at the table. So NCST had a seat at the table in this strategy. And so NCST's portion was to do a targeted strategy, a targeted deterrent strategy, essentially in the South Ward, where the city was experiencing the bulk of its violence. Now, I've known the mayor for 20 plus years. And in 2004, he had reached out to me when he was a principal of the biggest high school in the city of Newark, at Central High School, and told me that he had all these kids running around on campus in purple. And when he asked them where they was from, they claimed Grape Street. Now, Grape Street, as we know, is out of the Jordan Housing Projects and was a neighborhood that I grew up in. But also Grape Street happened to be the biggest Crip gang in the city of Newark and in the state of New Jersey. And so he asked me how the peace treaty was going, and he asked me if I would bring some of the brothers, you know, and sisters who were integral parts of creating and sustaining the peace in Watts, that in our first 2 years of the peace treaty, gang homicides dropped 44%, just to give you, you know, a frame around this community-based strategy. He asked if we could bring folks to the city to talk to some of the folks on the ground that were warring with each other about the peace treaty. So this was 2004. We went, we connected, we supported the mayor. In 2004, he was able to organize a peace treaty that had an impact on the city. when he became mayor in 2014. 2015, he called me and said, hey, come on, we're in power, and it's time for us to be able to work together to create a complementary strategy. So I was charged with essentially building infrastructure and putting systems in place and turning the strategy over to the local folks. The strategy is very similar to the one that we employ with GRID. It's a three-pronged strategy: high-risk intervention, victims, assertive outreach and victims advocacy, and a policy arm called the Public Safety Roundtable, which is very similar to our Watch Gang Task Force in the neighborhood. These three coordinated strategies provide a continuum of care with victims and survivors at the center of this overall strategy. So we recruit and hire non-traditional leaders in the neighborhood who are residents of the communities in which they serve. So NCST and the Community-Based Public Safety Collective is a complementary strategy to policing. And let me say that again. We're not an alternative, and we're not pushing alternatives to police. We need police. We're a complementary strategy, right? Because there's a pretty high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution. We used to think that you make an arrest and the problem was solved. But we now understand that there's a direct correlation between violence that happens in jail and on the street. Pookie can get arrested today and go to jail tonight, and tomorrow he can pick up the phone and make a call and knock somebody's head off in the street and vice versa. So there's a lot of maintenance work that has to go into resolving conflict and mediating these conflicts to a peaceful resolve, right? So the 5 prior years to the mayor launching his coordinated strategy, Newark had triple-digit numbers in homicides. So when folks ask about, like, is this, like when you look at the data, does it have an impact? I mean, Newark PD was spending $230 million a year and still had triple-digit homicides in the city. When we started at the end of 2016, once we had our first full, 2 years of programming, we had a double-digit reduction. We had a 12% reductions in homicide in the city. We followed that up every single year now with reductions. In 2019, we had a 20-year low, a 60-year low in the city. In the South Ward, where we targeted our strategy, we had a negative 48% reductions in homicide in the South Ward. In 2020, while the country spiked, in violence, we maintained our 60-year low with 51 homicides, and still 51 too many. In addition, our officers didn't fire their revolvers not once during the whole year of 2020. We had a 12,000 person protest in one pretty much like every day for weeks and had no arrest. In addition, we supported the mayor with moving 5% of the city's public safety budget into a new office of violence prevention and trauma recovery, creating a $12 million investment in supportive complementary strategies to policing in perpetuity, with support from our public safety director and our police union, right? So Newark has now become a national model. In 6 years, we've cut the homicide rate in half. We've improved community and police relationships. NCST has become the anchor nonprofit in the South Ward. When we started this work, we were 16 staff of independent contractors. Today, we're 50 full-time and part-time employees. We launched the city's first hospital-based violence intervention program. We brought the first trauma recovery center to Newark. In addition, we're in the process of launching the city's non-law enforcement response to opioids, to OD. In 2020 of last year, I resigned as ED because my job was done. The mayor asked me to build infrastructure, put systems in place, and turn it over to the locals. With all of the success we had, I was able to step back. My number 2, Damon Durden, who's a lifelong resident of the city of Newark, is now the new executive director. And our 12-member admin team now basically holds the work in the city. And I continue to serve as the board chair and also continue to advise the mayor on the city's public safety strategy. Now, LA pioneered this work, you all. However, over the past 20 years, investment has become stagnant. The city praises the GRID interventionists. 10 consecutive years, 2004 to 2014, of decreases in homicides. Law enforcement would always point to community-based intervention and say, hey, these are our partners, and thank you so much for helping us reduce violence and sustain that reduction in the city. However, over that 10 years, we saw LAPD's budget jump by $500 million, and community-based intervention got Nothing, essentially. With the election of Mayor Garcetti, the mayor brought in an additional $6 million, and we're also really excited. We supported, the budget that was just passed because we brought an additional $7 million to this work. It's important that we invest in the long-term, kind of strategy of public safety in the city, right? I was there at the beginning of Bridges 1 and Bridges 2. I was a contracted agency providing gang prevention intervention services in the city through Bridges 1 and actually through Bridges 2. I was there to see the evolution of the Gang Reduction Youth Development Program. Again, we celebrated our collective work, talking about community-based intervention as a complementary strategy to policing, to the police in the city. However, equity has been a pretty much one-sided conversation. The public execution of George Floyd is an inflection point, in terms of reimagining public safety, right? We need to invest deeper in community-based solutions, building the capacity of existing community-based public safety organizations through GRID, elevating the GRID director position to deputy mayor says that the city is prioritizing community-based solutions, right? I'll close on this and just say that we can't have public safety without the public family, right? For far too long, this idea that law enforcement is a single source of safety in our respective communities is just it's outdated. We have to expand and change the public safety narrative from one of a single source contact to a shared strategy. Public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime. It's also the presence of well-being and the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. Because we literally cannot have public safety without the public. And so I'd love to stop there and be able to respond to questions, comments, concerns that folks on the commission or on the Public Safety Committee might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. And colleagues, for those of you that have questions, if you can go ahead and raise your hand. I do want to start with one question, Akila. When you made reference to the technology, it's a two-part question, but you referenced the use of technology and kind of really how you're creating that systematic approach and the infrastructure that you set up, and you also made reference, for example, to the Watts Gang Task Force. The Watts Gang Task Force, for example, here in Los Angeles has had a really long, successful, and rich history in its work, working in that shared responsibility model with law enforcement. What we've found, when I look to areas in my own district, for example, in the San Fernando Valley, even with respect to our work around the CSP, getting that same level of involvement and commitment and coordination amongst the service providers is not as consistent. So can you help shed light, for example, on what technology played in terms of helping to share metrics, helping to build, when you talk about building out that strategy, how law enforcement coordinates with the service providers to build out a public safety strategy in a neighborhood or in an area, for example, where you're seeing heightened numbers of crime or whatever the circumstances are, whatever the data is telling us, how those service providers, how the street team was actively coordinating with law enforcement at a street level, and where the community was involved in helping to facilitate or communicate in a safe manner. Because sometimes, in a lot of communities, especially in immigrant communities, there's a lot of fear out of coming forward and communicating those things. So could you just kind of help touch and frame that a little bit, please?
Sure. Just in terms of our coordinated strategy on the ground with law enforcement, this is a hard-won relationship, that we built. When we first started our work, Anthony Ambrose, who's our former public safety director, shared with the mayor as well as with me directly, saying that our officers are really concerned about, the work that you guys are doing. And, they believe that, potentially you guys will interfere with investigations in the field. And one of the things that we did, we set up a annual training with the shooting team so that law enforcement learned our standard operating procedures and protocols. LA has like some of the best like kind of training infrastructure in the country. We have the Professional Community Intervention Training Institute with Akil Bashir. Dr. Bashir has trained our team in Newark for 7 consecutive years and has professionalized our workers so that we've developed now such a solid relationship with law enforcement. Like when we show up, like we're on the police dispatch very much like, you know, like the outreach workers in GRID. When we get the email from a shooting or a shooting hit, we respond to the scene. Our team never crosses a yellow line. It's not a part of our standard operating procedures and protocols. We have systems. So this work is not willy-nilly, family. So folks are not running out there like Keystone Cops to stand in the middle of situations and, you know, try to stop stuff. I mean, we operate on standard operating procedures and protocols, and it's what makes the work professional, right? When we launched the Public Safety Roundtable, we modeled it after the Watch Gang Task Force. So I brought our community partners as well as our law enforcement partners to LA, and we spent time at the Watch Gang Task Force, you know, looking at the strategy. And we utilized similar systems to be able to launch the Public Safety Roundtable in the South Ward, which has now become the most important policy forum in the city. So and at this forum, you know, we have law enforcement there that give CompStat updates. The community-based organization gives its updates on its mediation and interventions that it's doing in the community. We've developed such a significant relationship with Newark PD that they call us and give us intelligence. There's a pretty high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution. The cops, like shootings happening in the neighborhood, they can't always arrest somebody because people are not always willing to come forward and testify, and there's not always a weapon that's involved. And so they call us and they give us intelligence, and we utilize that intelligence to prevent retaliations, to deal with rumor control, and to stop things from happening on the ground in the neighborhood. And initially, again, they thought that it was problematic, but now they're like, hey, we're all invested in the same, you know, initiative, which is to make our neighborhoods safe. When our outreach workers or the high-risk intervention team responds to the scene, we document everything, you know, and I would say that that's a little different from what I've experienced in terms of GRID in LA. We utilize a system called Apricot. It's our internal CRM in which we collect all of the data. Every shooting that we respond to, the high-risk intervention does a report. You know, they do a follow-up maintenance report, and all of this information is aggregated and then provided to the city as a part of our CBVRI grant. We utilize different forms of technology as well to respond to residents in the community. We developed the 800 number so that residents can call us direct. And this is a compliment to law enforcement. We've seen the data that you know, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership produced. Something like 38%. Right, of 911 calls are serious, non-violent calls, you know, and it is better if there is a non-law enforcement response to some of those particular situations so that we could have our officers to focus on more serious crimes, you know, that are happening in the city, right? So we utilize the dispatch, we utilize Citizen App. Citizen App has become, you know, a really powerful tool for us to use because they aggregate 911 calls, they get that information out, you know, 22 seconds. You know, most of our law enforcement dispatches, we get 30 to 45 minutes after the incident has happened. And so Citizen allows us to get to the scene much quicker and to be able to respond, you know, to the residents in the community. We do these things called community walks. After every shooting that happens in the neighborhood, we do a community walk in those areas. And what we're checking for is residents who have been triggered by the violence, because we know that, you know, victims who don't get proper services in terms of healing services and recovery services are more likely to become victims, you know, when they don't get that support services, you know, that they need in order to support them in their respective healing journey. So those are, you know, Citizen, Apricot, you know, those are two of the real technological pieces that we use that has really kind of like revolutionized our work. The Public Safety Roundtable is that forum that pulls us together twice a month, law enforcement, community, faith, you know, municipal services in the city, so that we can actually engage in conversation and share intelligence with each other. And it's been a powerful forum so that we could actually uplift, you know, our law enforcement partners. Now, these conversations at the Public Safety Roundtable are not polite. And when law enforcement does something that is out of line, the community actually lets them have it, you know? And when they do something great in the community, we celebrate them. and we lift them up. And we've developed such a significant relationships with our cops that folks really call on the officers, to support them. And it's been really profound.
Thank you for that. Mr. Soboroff, I know you're in the queue, but I had some hands up over here, so let me first take Mr. De Leon.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And Mr. Sherrills, if I pronounced that correctly, thank you very much for your presentation. Let me ask a couple questions. One is, I like what you say, and I like the case study that you presented in New Jersey. So when we talk about, if you can expand a little bit on the after-school programs, apprenticeships for real jobs that provide a pathway to a career. When we talk about the mental health aspect, the trauma, the PTSD, I often have said if we unleashed a whole army of LCSWs, into communities that feel a lot of pain, that feel a lot of insecurity, that feel a lot of self-hatred. And that's separate from all the systemic racism, that has created the deep marginalization and isolation for decades, particularly when it comes to people of color in urban areas. When we talk about, psychotherapeutic services for the healing, for the trauma, for the PTSD, when we talk about just the whole legacies that some of our families have in California in particular, whether it's San Quentin, Folsom, Chino, Vacaville, or if it's a really bad situation, Pelican Bay, and folks coming back, and it's, generational. What I'm hearing from you is, I think what a lot of folks have spoken about, but I don't know if folks have sort of kind of brought it together in a very coherent fashion, linking it together strategically with that parallel, which we're referring to is we have public safety, we have our law enforcement officers who keep, our communities safe. We have the conflicts, and at the same time, we talk about all of these potential programs. Some programs work, some don't work, but we never really sort of kind of strategically said we're going to go at it in a very coherent fashion and have, accountability metrics to see if we're succeeding or not. If you could expand on that a little bit there. And then secondly, if you could, you talked about collaboration, cooperation with the police chief. I think you use another term, which is
Director, yes.
What they call?
The public safety director?
Public safety director, yes. It's an interesting name, but I think they call them in Chicago the superintendent, and I think of superintendent, I'm thinking about schools, public schools, the public safety director, you had buy-in with the public safety director, and then you had buy-in with the collective bargaining unit of the working men and women of law enforcement in New Jersey. How did that come about, and how was that buy-in with those folks? And is it still that way? Was it was all confetti and cutting ribbons and it was all fantastic, and then it just sort of kind of sputtered away a little bit? Or how is that working right now? And how did you get to come together and other folks?
Sure. I would say that, I'll start there and then work my way backwards, right? The relationship between law enforcement, as I said, when we do our initial training, we, for the community-based public safety initiative, we invited law enforcement to participate and be a part of it, so that they understood that we were a complementary strategy and not an alternative, to policing in the city. And that although we have different, probably, philosophical frames in terms of how we approach safety, we're all headed, we're taking different, roads to the mountaintop, right? And so, Newark has had, we're currently in our sixth year of a consent decree. And so we have documented history of the abuses that law enforcement has perpetrated against community. So it's not a guess game. We're not talking about, whether these things happen or not. they've happened. And so we're rebuilding, you know, our relationship, and the community is rebuilding trust, you know, with police. And so one of the things that the way that we utilize the Public Safety Roundtable is that we invite law enforcement to come and to express themselves and have the community to ask questions. So we've had the head of the state police, we've had the public safety director, we've had the chief, we've had the mayor, we've had the prosecutor, and, you know, we've had, you know, the head of our union, our police union, Jimmy Stewart, you know, and so they wrote an article basically, you know, challenging the whole consent decree in the city. And so we were able to bring, you know, them to the table to say, hey, listen, let's talk about common denominators, right? And to me, it was reminiscent of the movement and the work that we did in the state of California around victims and victims support. There's always been a powerful victims' rights movement in the state. The proponents of it have primarily been upper middle class white women who have experienced heinous violent acts, you know, and a lot of the laws that they pushed, you know, 3 strikes, you know, trying our children as adults and all those different things, has had a huge impact on communities of color in a negative way. And so when we sat down with the CVUs of the world, when we organized our work in the state of California and shifted the whole narrative around who victims are and what victims wanted, one of the questions that we shared with them was that, hey, listen, we might not agree politically and philosophically, you know, on this strategy. However, one of the things that we all can agree on is that we all want to heal from the trauma. And so healing became the common denominator for us to engage in conversations around work. And so with the union, with the police department, our common denominator is safety. You know, our common denominator is safety. And so that is the place where we connect and where we engage conversation and we do our training, right? You talked about, you know, the years of trauma. I mean, our cops, you know, experience a tremendous amount of vicarious trauma and hypervigilance in terms of this work. And rarely do they get the proper counseling, therapy, or whatever healing modality is necessary for them to heal, right? In terms of the work that they do. If a cop even talks about emotional distress or psychological like kind of pressure, man, they'll get rubber gunned and desk, you know? It threatens their ability to be able to provide for their families and loved ones. You know, a lot of these officers became cops because of something that they experienced in their personal life because they wanted to bring safety to the community. But the culture of policing is very, you know, like kind of cowboyish, right? And so there's a real need, you know, to be able to help shift, you know, the culture without kind of like throwing away like, you know, the safety that they actually provide for us via the community. And so the only people that can really help them with that is the public. You know, the public has to actually come together to be able to call for more therapeutic services and healing services and support services for cops and to make those things transparent. Because we want our cops to come to work, you know, ready, and when they meet the public, that they're grounded and rooted in their humanity. You know, we don't need them struggling with, you know, with situations because we know what that leads to. It leads to excessive force issues. It leads to misconduct. And then what basically ends up happening is that taxpayers end up paying hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits, you know, as a result of it. And so this is one of the things that one of the reasons why we work together, that we're trying to decrease this, the impact, because when the city pays out lawsuits, you know, for these unintended consequences and collateral damage, it's like it comes out of our pockets too, right? And so we want to decrease these things, you know, just as much. And I think that law enforcement kind of shares our frame around it. Just in terms of like kind of trauma support, one of the things that I'm most proud of in terms of the work that I did in California was passing SB 580, the Trauma Recovery Center bill. It created a situation where people in the neighborhood can self-identify as victims in order to access services and resources. Currently, I mean, up until the Trauma Recovery Center was developed, essentially folks have to go through the police department in order to be deemed a victim to actually access services. This was one of the administrative changes that we made that had a significant impact in Newark. When detectives put suspect victim on police reports, it automatically disqualifies them from receiving victims' comp and victim services. So when we met with Ambrose, the public safety director, and asked for an administrative change in that, and he sent out a memo to the detectives and told them, to the shooting team, don't put suspect victim on the application. Do you know, I mean, Newark, 90% of black folks in the city were denied victims comp and victim services prior to this. You know, we had the prosecutor's office come and put up signs everywhere, and it increased our applications and people being able to access victims comp and victim services like threefold in the city, right? This is an important like kind of strategy in terms like for PD to be able to provide services for victims and survivors in community, because usually the district attorney office holds that that purse, and the police department has to go through the DA's office also to access victim services. And I think that it's a much better way if you have a victim services unit that is embedded in LAPD, to be able to support that. We launched a Safe Passage program, right? So we're at 12 schools in the South Ward. This is one of the ways that we've decreased that number by 48%, is because our non-traditional leaders serve as a deterrent to violence. Every morning from 7:30 to 9, from 2:30 to 4, they're making sure our kids go to school safely and come home. They're posted at key exit and entries. They're at the bus stop. They're at the bodega. They're at the bando, at the abandoned house, making sure that our folks are safe. They have a hardship fund. They address emergency needs. They get haircuts. They buy uniforms. They get umbrellas. They buy jackets. They do all of these things, right? Because most of the violence, most of the trauma in the neighborhood is because of quality of life issues that get unaddressed. Now, we employ Pookie in them, right? Like 100% of our staff are residents of the communities in which we live. The folks who come out of these communities all suffer from traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, vicarious trauma. There's been a lack of investment in people and infrastructure in these communities for decades. And so people are easily triggered. And so we've employed hundreds of people at this point, and we had a lot of turnover because of the trauma, and people can't kind of get out of their own way of their traumatic experiences. And so as a result of that, we brought in Toby Sanders, who developed a workforce development program within the organization based upon a system of andragogy, which is adult education. We call it transformational education. And as a result of that, we've been able to keep, a lot of our folks, because we had like a 30-40% like kind of attrition rate in terms of turnover with our staff, but we've been able to, and we haven't looked at the data just yet, but we've been able to retain a lot of our staff because of this system of transformational education and andragogy. And so for us, that's a really, really important piece that has to be embedded in community-based public safety organizations. We have to understand trauma-informed management. And then finally, Councilman, the TRC, as I stated, we launched TRCs in California, and then we worked with Dr. Basilari up in San Francisco, and we brought 2 TRCs to New Jersey. We got our Attorney General and our Governor the Attorney General and the Governor in New Jersey to move VOCA dollars, our Victims of Crime Act dollars, to support this work, and it funded 4 trauma recovery centers to the tune of about $6 million, about $1.2 million per site. And NCST applied, and we were awarded. And so now we have a full cachet. Now, when we first started, we were able to get some money from one of our local foundations to hire like a therapist, Seton Davis, to provide therapeutic services for our staff as well as our participants. And now, there's a huge barrier around mental health services. We call them wellness services because there's a stigma. If you say mental health and stuff like that, people are not coming, right? And so most of our clients come through our outreach workers, our high-risk interventionists. They walk them, they handhold them into the building, essentially, and sometimes sit in on their sessions. We now have a full cachet of therapists, and all the therapists are from the neighborhoods in which we serve. Seton Davis is now the director of our Trauma Recovery Center. And we started in September of last year. By October, we had a waiting list. We've now serviced over 170 folks, in terms of our work, and expanding. So this it's framing, it's language, in terms of the approach, and coordinated like kind of systems, through every aspect of the organization, whether it's a public safety roundtable or referrals. We get direct referrals from NPD. Captain Peppers at the 5th Precinct will call us in a minute and be like, hey, we just picked up a 14-year-old who stole a car, and we're sending them to you. This is the station house adjustment, piece that the NPD has had up and running, but now, through the mayor's support, we're able to get this thing actually off the ground and get real referrals out the door.
Well, thank you very much. And Madam Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question too. Like to, offline, obviously, Mr. Sherrill's learn more about the TRCs. As we all know, I think anyone can attest to finding a good therapist is hard enough. Finding a whole army of therapists or culturally competent, to go into our hoods, specifically and deal with a different type of trauma as opposed to marriage family therapist, which has been largely middle class and upper middle class driven if you have an HMO or PPO. This is a very different type of psychotherapeutic, services that are critical. And as you say, the framing with mental, support services to wellness service, because of the stigma that we all have with regards to if we're depressed, if we're bipolar, we don't want no one to know because of all the stigmatization that goes with it, and so much of that trauma that we have, so many folks within the spectrum we have within our own communities who never get access at a very early age to these types of services, because it comes down to socioeconomics. It comes down to, and that's why you have to sort of intentionally move the necessary resources for all of this to drive down, our incarceration rates, drive down, potential incarceration rates, so we can deal with the trauma. And to your point with regards to the three strikes probably was the largest public safety experiment catastrophe in the history of the United States of America, where you had law enforcement, you had prosecutors, you had a very deeply aggrieved father who lost his daughter in a horrific tragedy, which is real, which is valid, but because that emotional pain and that anger and other types of values that were brought to the process in the backyard in Central Valley, in effect, Three Strikes was created. And it didn't really, depress crime at all whatsoever. It had a disproportionate impact, as we know, on people of color. Being in prison, 25 years of life. But I thank you very much. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Madam Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you. And so I'm going to ask, and thank you, Mr. De Leon. I know I've got a few folks in the queue. Ms. Decker, followed by Mr. O'Farrell, and then Mr. Soboroff, and then Mr. Buscaino. So I just want to make sure we give everyone ample time. The one observation I want to make really quickly, Akilah, because I know we've got a lot of alignment in the pieces of this puzzle. What we don't have is the coordinated response in the same systematic way that you're presenting it with Newark. And I know you've made reference to that, but I think that's, I feel like that's our missing piece here, along with some of the interesting assets you talked about with the use of technology and the Citizen app in particular. I'm most interested in kind of learning more about that as well. But with that, I'm going to now provide an opportunity to Ms. Decker, if you'd please go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman. If I could ask you, by the way, Mr. Shrills, thank you so much for your presentation today. It was very helpful and informative. And to pick up on the conversations that you've been having with the council members, I wonder if you could more specifically turn towards the City of LA grid. You talked about grid and the investment needed. You talked about elevating the director position to deputy mayor. I'm wondering if you could contrast this to what you're seeing in Newark and what you would recommend specifically with respect to grid in terms of ensuring it is the most effective program that the City of Los Angeles can make. And I realize you've answered a little bit of that in the prior questions. I just don't want to miss the opportunity to pick your brain completely as it relates to grid in the City of Los Angeles.
Yes, and thank you, Ms. Decker. Absolutely. I think that it starts with leadership. And so, whoever's directing grid, I think that this needs to be a deputy mayor level position, because it gives it the visibility and it says to the city, to the residents, that the city is actually invested in prioritizing community-based solutions as a complement to public safety, to policing, right? I think that, grid by and large, with all of the challenges that it has had a huge impact in terms of reducing violence and crime in the 23 areas in the city. I was, referencing, and I always reference and use the 2020 grid report, You know, in terms of like, you know, a 41% reduction in retaliatory homicides over the years since it's been in existence. I mean, it says a lot, right? And so we're talking about these ragtag organizations that don't have a lot of infrastructure, that does not do a lot of, you know, data collection and data sharing, but yet with $11 million allocation, they're having such a huge impact. And so I'm like, if we invest more into some of the pieces that the councilwoman just spoke to around coordination, because I think that that's where we're missing a lot. So we need much better coordination in terms of like kind of talks amongst the agencies and the organizations on the ground. I think that that we need capacity building support and technical assistance for the organizations. You know, GRID has changed a lot, you know, over the years. I think that a lot of the small mom and pop organizations that are now contracting with agencies like you know, Catholic Big Brothers or you know, Salvation Army, or you know, the agencies who have the fiscal capacity to apply for the RFQ through GRID. But you know, he or she who controls the finance controls the program and the program design as well. So I think that we have a unique opportunity where we can actually build the capacity of community-based public safety agencies. And I'm talking about kind of organizational development, like strategic planning, like fund development. Some of our GRID agencies have one contract, and that's with GRID, and that's it. You know, we need to help build them up so that they have a diversified funding base. If GRID goes away, they still have infrastructure and services that they can provide. Technical assistance, you know, and training support, right? We've up to this point have had like kind of a single like kind of training institution in Levita, you know, which has done great work, right? But we need a diverse kind of like training institute, right? I think, you know, to me, Levita professionalizes community-based interventions to do the paperwork and be able to manage and run organizations. The Professional Community Intervention Training Institute, you know, trains individuals in the field how to de-escalate strategies, you know, utilizes a scenario-based training, you know, kind of model to engage folks, you know, in the public safety strategy. So I think that there are multiple like strategies. It's not a either or, it's a both and, you know, that we have to bring to bear on this work. And I think that you know, just in terms of investment, you know, our interventionists in the field are on the very low end, you know, of salaries. It's expensive to live in Los Angeles. Interventionists are making like $33,000 a year. I think they just talked about giving them a raise to 36. I'm like, with no benefits, you know, with no life insurance, this work is extremely dangerous. It's dangerous. Ask our officers. Our officers will tell you that this work is dangerous, right? And so now we have residents, you know, who are putting their lives on the line, and they have to. It's not a choice, you know. If it was a choice, I mean, you know, folks wouldn't do it, you know. But we have to, because we're losing so many of our loved ones in the neighborhood, and we just have to have a complementary strategy. We have to bring these individual salaries up to par, you know. You know, $45,000, $50,000 a year, benefits, life insurance. I mean, these things are important. Most of our interventionists are grandparents now. You know, they're in their late 40s and 50s, you know, still doing the work. I want to lift up my brother, Jeff Harmon, who passed last year, you know, from COVID. Frontliner, 20 years, you know, community-based public safety activist and practitioner in the city. He passed, man, and his legacy is us and his kids. You know, there's no pension. There's no recognition of the work that he did over in this neighborhood to reduce and prevent homicides and retaliations, man. It's like, we're like, hey, there's a real opportunity here, you know, in terms of creating like kind of balance. And I think that, you know, that our patrol officers in those respective communities that work with us would agree that it would benefit the city, you know, to have well-paid, well-resourced, you know, individuals and organizations who are complementary strategies to law enforcement in the city. I think it would help us with the clearance rate in terms of homicides. You know, I think that you know, it could have an impact on multiple levels.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
Thank you so much. I believe next up was Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and everyone. My hand raise icon has vanished from my screen. So thanks for calling on me. And Ms. Rodriguez, thank you so much for assembling us together and for inviting guests such as Mr. Sherrills to this panel. This is a really powerful, meaningful conversation, and I'm very grateful to be part of this. I'm grateful to you for organizing this. Mr. Sherrill, I am so impressed and fortified by your report and the passion and the authority from which you speak because of your own lived experience and your determination to put your experience into action that is saving lives, that is improving communities, that is bridging so many gaps in the social safety network and infrastructure that exists and that we all inherited and are living within. And I think from your perspective, that's how we bring real change. And what I really love, I wrote this, the first word I wrote down was healing. Your emphasis just on healing in general, no matter where you are on the spectrum or what your profession is or what your life experience is, and that's the focus on healing. That is a human need. And the fact that you convey so clearly that trauma is an equal opportunity affliction. And we are very sensitive, sentient beings, us humans, and we all need healing. And when you focus on healing the way you do with all of your, with your mission here, that means you're focusing on healing and not focusing on judging. You're focusing on healing and you're not focusing on the divisions. You're focusing on healing, you're not focusing on the rancor or the finger pointed because you're focused on the healing. And that is a solution-based outlook if there ever was one. And I just think that's so healthy.
Thank you.
People have deprivations in their lives by virtue of the race they were born into or the socioeconomic circumstances they were born into. And when people are deprived, that leads to the whole spectrum of social ills that affect everyone. And I think you have really, made that so clear. And deprivation leads to things like incarceration and ultimately, and where I'm going to, it leads to other things like homelessness.
Yep.
I was just wondering, sir, if you have thought about the intersection of your work, your very important work, and the intersection with homelessness. Because the demographic that experiences homelessness is very similar to the demographic that ends up incarcerated in higher numbers, in higher percentages. There's a similarity there, there's an intersection in my view. And the reason I bring this up is because this is what we are focused on as a city.
Sir.
Untangling the underlying causes of the moral crises that we're all living with, and that is, homelessness and how to really reduce it and make fundamental changes in that, just like you're making fundamental changes in this interpersonal universe of relationships with law enforcement and advocates and community and everything else. So I was just wondering, sir, if you thought about that intersection and how, if you would be willing, or if you already have, sat down with organizations like Urban Alchemy that I'm working with very closely, and other colleagues are also working with very closely, because I feel they really get it. And I feel that you really get it, and how that could be a cross-beneficial relationship.
Yes, sir. Urban Alchemy, Dr. Lena Miller, one of my really close friends. We've known each other, for 20 plus years. We first met through Governor Newsom, actually, when he was mayor in San Francisco. They were having a lot of problems in the city. Lena Miller was actually running the Hunters Point Family Network, which was a coalition of community-based public safety organizations doing services in the city. And so we met that way. And we've stayed connected, all of this time. So even while I was in Newark, I would, because, Lena is a protege of Dr. Nadine Burke, as well. And so we were talking about bringing, Dr. Miller to Newark. And recently I was having a conversation with our new housing czar, homeless czar in the city of Newark, Sakina Hoyt. And she was telling me, guess what? We're bringing Dr. Lena Miller and Urban Alchemy to Newark, So I think that we have an exceptional kind of person, first of all, in Dr. Lena Miller. She is like someone that is from the streets, understands it, lived the work. I watched her start, Urban Alchemy and build this organization to a 600 person, phenomenal work, right? This is the type of, strategy that we need in the city on the ground. I think, Councilman, that therein lies the solution, to our homelessness situation as a part of a larger strategy. LA Can has been doing work, on the ground and on Skid Row forever. Pete White's a real ally. And so I think that with the work that Urban Alchemy is doing, it's really kind of like revolutionary. And so I would actually lean towards that. Urban Alchemy is also a part of the community-based public safety collective family. And so because they're boots on the ground, they hire non-traditional leaders. And many of those folks are former homeless people, who are actually engaging folks in the field, providing support and wraparound services to them. I think that that's the model. And then now that, that the city council and the mayor has proposed $800 million investment in the initiative, I'm like, hey, let's go. I think that we have a great start. So I'm really excited about the work that's happened with Urban Alchemy in the city and think that it's a model that really needs to be expanded.
That's fantastic. I agree completely. And forgive me for underestimating the fact that you go way back, because good people find one another, especially when missions are so similar. So that's really terrific. It's all about investing in people that have never been adequately invested in. And that's what I keep talking to the media about when I face some criticisms for the costs of the tiny home villages or of the safe sleep sites, et cetera. It's investments. And lastly, Madam Chair, I'll say this to Mr. Sherrills in the panel, is that Urban Alchemy is now hiring formerly homeless Angelenos, including someone who was sleeping previously at Echo Park. So we could stand up a whole new workforce and give a new lifeline and steady employment people right here in Los Angeles. And I just think it's has incredible and profound potential, and we're already seeing results through that partnership. So, Mr.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much
you, Mr.
at your
Mr. O'Farrell.
service.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So we do have a couple more speakers in the queue, and then I still want to get to Mr. Young. Next in the queue, we've got Mr. Soboroff, followed by Mr. Buscaino, and then Ms. Calanche. And if we can please be very succinct, Aquila, we want to make sure that we get everybody, moving, because I know we're going to be running out of time sooner than not. So, Mr.
I'll be
Soboroff.
concise with my answers too.
Okay, my question, one is 5 seconds and then the other one is 15 seconds. But the first question is, do you still live in New Jersey?
Yes, I'm living in New Jersey now.
Will you look out your window right now and you will see a moving van that just pulled up, headed to Los Angeles?
Yes.
Put your stuff in there and get back here. What's the matter with you?
Hey, Mr. Soboroff, I'm on my way back home. That's why I was saying that. Hey, I resigned last year. I'm moving and making my way back west.
Okay. Well, you're a pro, and pros make tough things look easy. And the word that I wrote down, and this is my second question, it's a very short question also, is the word headwinds. It used to be that, if you're looking at a football field, that the extremists were in the end zones or up to the 5-yard line on both sides. And those extremists didn't want you to succeed, and they were angry and everything else. Today, the extremists seem to be up to the 45-yard line from each side. They don't want you to succeed for whatever reason. And so that creates, in order to get things done, you got to walk a much finer line. And my question to you, my word that I wrote down was headwinds. How do you deal with all these headwinds? What are your headwinds? And what do you think ours are?
Just in terms of, challenges, I mean, I think that that you pretty much said it, that it's binary stuff. We constantly get caught up in the it should be this or that. It's police or it's community-based public safety. I'm like, no, it's both. And I had some some folks reach out to me about supporting the city council and the mayor's budget. And just to be transparent, like, Melina Abdullah is one of my best friends. I mean, we've grown up together. We've known each other for many years. I am I respect, the Black Lives Matter movement and the proponent of it, because it's about, declaring, the sovereignty of Black bodies in this country, right? And I think that we could say that and not like, and I could say that and say that I support, the mayor's budget. I think that it's visionary. And I supported 100%. So, and I gave a statement to that support, right? And then I speak to my allies on the other side, and I share with them that, hey, it's not an either or. We have to declare the small victories that we're having in terms of this work. And to me, the city budget was a small victory, for us. And I'm like, and let's build off of the successes, as opposed to talk about like, oh, it's too much money to the police. I'm like, hey, we got to invest in cops. We have to invest in procedural justice training. We have to invest in de-escalation strategies. We have to invest in making sure that they're healthy and they're well, emotionally and psychologically as they meet the public. And that requires an investment, right? And so I'm like, although I could hold frames and certain like kind of ideas, I like to think that my approach is one of, as the councilman said, is always looking for the common denominator, to try to find like kind of how do we work together, and how do we bring these particular pieces together? Because being stuck at opposite ends of the park and then arguing about how we ain't in the middle, I'm like it's just counterproductive, and I'm like I want to move things forward, and I want to be honest about like kind of where the challenges are. In terms of the work. I think that in LA, like one of our biggest challenges has been the political will to invest in complementary strategies. Every year we're asking for more and more money, and we watch LAPD's budget balloon from $1 billion to $2.5 billion, and we know that they depend upon us in the community, in terms of, preventing retaliatory violence and intervening in conflicts and mediating things to a peaceful outcome. And we're like, hey, we want to be considered a part of the public safety infrastructure in this city. And we do work too, and it needs to be invested in. And we can't be volunteering doing this work. We have to incentivize peace because it is dangerous, difficult work. And we're like, we want to have strategic partnerships. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Aquila. That was great. Mr. Buscaino.
Thank you, Akil. I'm right outside. You can come in my car. I'm here to pick you up. Thank you, Madam Chair, Honorable Police Commissioners, Chief Moore, and members. Aquila has been on the forefront in Watts. He's one of our own, as I mentioned earlier at the kickoff. We're just so proud him and the other fit soldiers who've been in this line of work for decades, who I've been blessed to work alongside when I was a police officer for 15 blessed years, even more so as a senior lead officer, knowing the importance of community-based policing and the importance of intervention, community-based intervention. And Aquila reminds all of us that Los Angeles has been the national leader in quote unquote reimagining public safety. We've been doing it for decades, and I've seen it. I've lived it as a police officer, continue to advocate for as a council member based on my lived experiences when I was at a gang homicide, picking up the phone, talking to a gang intervention worker. And that was unheard of. That continues to be unheard of in other parts of the country. When, a dear friend of mine, Columbus, Ohio, City Council President Chardon Harding calls me and says, hey, tell me about LA and the Police Commission and the Civilian Oversight Commission. We're looking at doing that. We are decades ahead of this, members and colleagues, and we ought to be proud of that. I just wish, Keila, that you can speak to the thousands upon thousands who, protested the streets and they were heard loud and clear. I wish they can, those who caused destruction and chaos in our city who came in from elsewhere, I wish they can hear your testimony and the line of work that you're doing every single day. We ought to be proud of how far we've come, recognizing that I know we can do more. As I remind my colleagues in this Public Safety Committee, quality through continuous improvement is one of our core values, the LAPD, something that I've embraced as a police officer. I want to just, something that we can turn to, Akilah, and what your thoughts are. What are we doing to go after the $5 billion in federal monies that were made available from the Biden administration?
Yes, sir. Just an unprecedented, and thank you so much, Councilman, for the kind words and also for the great work that you continue to do in the community. We're excited about our Juneteenth celebration that's about to go down.
Saturday.
Yes, sir. I'm actually flying back tomorrow morning. So
All right.
I think that we've been doing a lot of work currently with the White House on the $5 billion investment. This is unprecedented. $5.3 billion over 8 years is being proposed to be invested in community-based public safety work. The White House is also looking right now at immediate investment, because during the summer, violence traditionally spikes in our respective, cities all across the country. And so we're looking right now at doing an immediate strategy, 15 cities, roll out coordinated kind of services with some of the top technical assistance and training institutes in the country, the Hospital Alliance for Violence Intervention, the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform, who just did a really powerful report out of the Westmount area, just in terms of cost of violence report. I think they did 2 reports for the city. Cities United, who has been working with mayors all across the country to help develop, these safe, healthy, and hopeful kind of strategies. And the Community-Based Public Safety Collective is a part of that partnership. So there's a lot of work. There's the immediate work that's happening to roll out the summer piece, and then there's a long-term strategy, right? That is being pretty much led by our folks at Fund Peace. Our brother, Fernando Rijan with UPI is leading kind of some of our organized effort in the city. And so right now it's more conversations with our Congress folks, because that's where it's, we have to get the support and pass this thing through the legislature. And then, we're going to be doing this kind of state and local advocacy, working with the governors and mayors in cities to be able to move that $5 million to our respective work on the ground. And so we're working out kind of the details now. We still have a long way to go, but we're really excited to be in conversation consistently with the White House. I mean, they've really embraced this work. The president has made it a priority, in his overall, strategy. And it blew us all away when we were all at the Rose Garden, and the president and the attorney general basically said that, that law enforcement is not the only solution to public safety in the city, in the country. That there are complementary strategies, that we need to invest in to have a more holistic approach. And this is because we're growing and we're developing. And so we're excited, about that. So there's a lot of advocacy work that's happening on the ground. I would just really defer to my man, to Fernando Rijan over at UPI, who's leading our Fund Peace work on the ground today. And yeah.
We'll see you Saturday.
Yes, sir, you will.
Thank you so much. Miss Galanche, and then I know we got to get to Mr. Young, so Miss Galanche.
Hi, so sorry. Thank you so much, Mr. Sherrills. I'm so excited to hear your presentation. I have a ton of questions. I hope I can follow up with you after. I have a couple of questions that you kind of brought up in your presentation about what work has happened in Newark, but I want to see if you can, because of your experience here in LA, if you can connect it to how we can kind of create some sort of system that addresses violence in our community. So one of the things you talked about was continuum of care. We have all the resources in LA and they're just not coordinated, right? So I'm wondering, you know, and one of the issues in LA is that, you know, the county provides mental health, health services, children's services. And then as a city, we're trying to address, you know, community violence, we're trying to address poverty, we're trying to address all these other issues, but there isn't a comprehensive approach. So I'm wondering if in Newark, if there's been a model used to bring those entities, and I don't know, maybe there isn't the same type of government structure where you have the city and the county, but I feel like to provide that trauma-informed care, the continuum of care, to partner with law enforcement, we need to be able to bring all those resources together in a comprehensive effort versus everyone's kind of doing their thing and they're in silos. So I'm wondering if there's a way that it's done in Newark that can be kind of replicated or modeled here in LA.
Yeah, so two things. First, it was the Safer Newark Council that the mayor launched to coordinate the city's public safety strategies. And it served its purpose for its kind of like first 3 years, and then it kind of like went away to the to the side, because I think that that we got connected. And so now we're in consistent conversation with each other and we're sharing resources. The follow-up from that was Rutgers University launched the Newark Public Safety Collective. And so Rutgers basically organized all of the partners, and they're utilizing, they have a criminologist who is embedded at NPD, at the Newark Police Department, who provides all of the data for us. And so like when we do safe passage in the community, NPSC, the Newark Public Safety Collaborative, now provides us the data for the walking area. So they'll give us the heat maps and show us where violence happens, so that we can actually organize our strategy, so that the interventionists, the outreach workers, are actually walking through the areas where you know high violence is happening in the city. So we're utilizing like kind of this technology and this coordinated conversation to be able to work a lot more together. The mayor also launched something called the Brick City Peace Collective. This is so that he can organize all of his community-based public safety initiatives in the city. And you know, it's about 4 or 5 of us, and it's, you know, it's challenging, right? Because traditionally these organizations are in competition with each other over resources.
Right.
And so one of the things that we've tried to play, the role that we've tried to play, the Newark Community Street Team in that relationship, because we've been able to leverage dollars from multiple sources and have a pretty diverse like kind of funding base, is to support our other partner organizations in building capacity. Like literally last night, I was just sharing our bylaws with New Directions, who is one of the new kind of community-based public safety initiatives that is emerging in the city, so that they can get their 501c3 set up. You know, and then I'm connecting them with the attorney who actually filed our paperwork for us. So we're sharing like kind of like intelligence and resources, so that we can, because it's not a competition. You know, this is the thing that I consistently tell our partners. We're not in competition. I'm like, there's so much need out here that we could have 3 NCSTs in the city and we would still be kind of scratching the surface of our collective work.
Right.
So
a quick follow-up about the capacity building. One of the concerns I have, even the way that LA does procurement of these like gang prevention or gang intervention services, it's like these nonprofits are competing with each other, right? So it doesn't create, you know, a space for collaboration, right? And then because a lot of them, this is their main, you know, grant, they want to do everything they can to hold on to these grants. So we've just created dependency versus building capacity, right? So I feel like we can fund almost every group that wants to do grassroots community investment, violence prevention in communities, without having to create this competition between organizations and invest to build their capacity. That's a huge need, right? Because then from one day to another, an organization could disappear, right? Because we rely so heavily on the city funding.
Yep.
But yeah, so I totally agree with you with the capacity building. But I have a lot of questions that I'll save them. Maybe I can connect with you at another time. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And one of the things that I'll share is that our hope is that the Community-Based Public Safety Collective can actually provide some of that capacity building support and technical assistance and training support to our organizations on the ground. Because we have significant relationships, I've been instrumental in bringing resources probably to a lot of our partners already in the city. But as our profile kind of grows and we develop more strategic relationships with large philanthropic organizations, I mean, we've been having some really interesting and significant conversations with philanthropy because, we have wellness, we have endowment, we have, Liberty Hill, we have, Balmer. We have a few organizations that have been invested in community-based public safety work, but by and large, most organizations don't. Most philanthropic organizations don't. And so we're working with philanthropy now to say that, that Ford, that Kresge, that MacArthur, Arnold, all of you guys should have a community-based public safety fund. Because in that way, we can better leverage philanthropic dollars so that we can support, and work with cities to bring in that long-term sustainability dollars, right? And then there's other opportunities that we also want to share as a way of being able to incentivize peace and make sure that this work is sustainable.
Right. And us as the public safety folks for kind of the oversight and the elected officials can talk to those foundations to get them to invest in these organizations.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akila. And, and I know that there are colleagues that still have additional questions, but I want to make sure that we provide an opportunity for Mr. Young. And so I am certain that people will be following up with you offline as well. But I think, what you really captured and reflected is the how important the coordination is in terms of delivering these resources in a manner that actually gets to the root causes of what is causing these public safety issues in some respects in certain neighborhoods. And I think, we've got a lot of the right pieces, but, and this is helpful for the fact that we need to be more introspective about what's missing. And we can't be fearful of saying that, well, we've already done this or we've already got it. It's how do we refine it and improve upon it?
That's right.
And I think, and recognizing how important it is for the coordinated relationship with law enforcement, how much all of these components are really necessary. And so I just want to thank you for, obviously, we also benefit from the fact that you have such incredible history and knowledge here in Los Angeles as well. And we look forward to you returning home so we could continue this great narrative back here at home in Los Angeles. So I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Councilwoman. And I appreciate you all, council members, Police Commission Board. Thank you all so much for the great work that you're doing in the city.
Thanks so much, Akila. And Ms. Decker, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide the introduction to Mr. Young.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman. And I'm very pleased for my colleagues, council members and commissioners to introduce to you Mr. Joshua Young. He is the Deputy Senior Vice President of the Justice Initiatives for the Center for Policing Equity. The Center for Policing Equity, as I'm sure you're aware, is an organization consisting of research scientists, race and equity experts, data experts, and community trainers. They use data to build more fair and just systems. They partner with law enforcement and communities all around the United States to bridge the divide of communication, generational mistrust, and suffering. Fundamentally, they use science to help build public safety, community trust, and racial equity. Mr. Young at the Center for Policing Equity is Senior Vice President, responsible for strategic planning, leading cross-functional initiatives, organizational design, and change management. In short, he works with communities and law enforcement all around the country on ways to use data to help reimagine policing. And we're going to hear today from him and some of his experiences around the country. Mr. Young, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your patience. I could tell from your reaction to our prior presenter that you knew many of the people he's been working with and many of the programs that he described. So I'm sure there's great synergy in your presentations. Thank you, Mr. Young, for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I loved every minute of it. So pleasure to be here. Madam Chairwoman and also Councilwoman Rodriguez, thank you, committee members and commissioners, Chief Moore and our community members. I appreciate the invitation. And, Akila, too, the last thing you mentioned, or one of the last things you mentioned, which really resonated with me was this false dichotomy that we hear. It's, if you support Black Lives Matter, you can't support police. And I find that such a destructive type of framework, and it's disheartening. I hear it just too often, and it overlooks the basic, I think, premise of what you're getting at is the police should be part of the community, and the community should be part of the police. There doesn't have to be a either or that we're picking from. So I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate your energy, and I recognize all the great work that you're doing. So thank you again for your comments. I'm going to just kind of speed up. President Decker, was there a presentation that was going to be up that I was going to be able to control?
I believe you were given screen sharing authority.
Okay. Got it. So let me do that then. All right. Bring it back up the presentation. I'll make sure that if you guys just give me a thumbs up once you're able to see my screen. Yeah, okay, great. So, there it is. I think it's finally working now. So the first thing I wanted to hit on is also an acknowledgement of this meeting, because I think philosophically, what it communicates to me that there is energy and motivation to understand the current state we're in, but then also to chart a path forward for more equitable policing. I often hear nationally and internationally when I'm speaking is conversations on police reform, and they always seem to appear that there's some type of finish line, which is always a bit concerning to me because when we talk about culture change or reform in policing or public safety, there really is no end game. It's just a continuous effort. So I applaud the recognition that this is not a light switch that we turn on and we see change. There has been an erosion of trust between the community and the police, and that needs to be reconciled. And if there's any illusion that's going to take place overnight, it's unfortunately going to be a false type of a hope. I think to sustain reform, it takes us to this place where we have to understand the community's expectations of law enforcement and how they define law enforcement in their particular communities. And I do recognize that some people get rather nervous, I think, when I speak on police reform or public safety reform. Some may be more nervous than others because there's an uneasiness about moving away from the status quo. And I recognize that, and I think we should be concerned about the consequences of transitioning to a model that is more holistic in nature. But I would also suggest that staying within the status quo also poses a significant risk. We know what the consequences are of not changing. And so while I recognize the complexities politically, I think if we center the communities, we'll recognize that if we keep the focus that this is a policing problem, we have truly missed the mark. To tackle anything resembling true reform, it requires a system and structure change of our current, what we call a system, but actually operates as more siloed organizations working independently. And I was curious to see the diversity in LA. Did a quick search, and you guys, I've been all over the country speaking with communities, and I noticed that LA, I think, has over 200 languages that are spoken here. It's such a diverse community. And so what that tells me is that there's a tremendous opportunity to improve the health and wellness of the community, understanding the micro locations of communities who are more impacted and experience more harm than others. And how we go about that is we get into this process, which you'll hear me speak about often tonight. Is the process is really more important in many cases than the end result. It's bringing the community along with us every step of the way. The community is tired, I think, of having reports made behind the scene or behind closed walls or behind the government offices and presented to them. They should be a part of that process along the way, and I hope to show you some examples of what we have done to set maybe some examples. But I also want to be cautious, being reflective. We have used the best evidence that we have. Our co-founder was a 30-year law enforcement executive with a tremendous amount of experience and a wealth of knowledge. Our CEO, Dr. Philip Atieva-Goff, he's a professor at Yale University. We're very much a science organization and think tank. But what we've used is the evidence surrounding on the peripheral, from poverty to education to crime, and we control for all those to identify disparities that we could overcome. And as we do that, we get into this conversation of how can we take steps practically, because everyone's tired of talking theoretically, to move the needle. Let's see if I could do presenter mode and be a little more professional. Can you guys still see it? So it's giving me all these cues now. So let me just fast forward through this. One thing I saw that I wanted to especially applaud the LAPD for is their community relation division. This is something that is something in line with what we do. So I wanted to go back off that because it's like making my whole computer black. So if you don't mind this view. This is something that we see synergy with. This is something that we focus on. It's building relationships. And what does that mean? So what we try to do is collect and analyze broad sets of data, and we try to maintain our objectivity. So we look at two types of data. One is what you usually recognize as more of the quantitative piece, right? So we'll get into most of your crime data, workload analysis, staffing analysis. We try to understand where cops are spending their time relative to where the community needs them. What kind of calls for service, for example, are the police responding to? And do they need to respond to those types of calls? And why? I think police have been the best spokespeople and recognize that they don't need to be sent to many of these calls. It's just because, unfortunately, the way the system has been moving lately, everything has seemed to fall on law enforcement. You call 911 and you get a cop for almost everything. I spent 15 years in law enforcement in California, and also time on a SWAT team. And I get it. There are so many times when you go on calls, and you're like, why am I here for? I have a badge and a gun. This is a homelessness issue, for example, or an unhoused person. They don't need a badge and a gun. They need a house and four walls, They need support. And so we try to identify those areas where there could be wraparound services or maybe long-term rehabilitation services. And that takes people outside of law enforcement, but also takes a different structuring of the current public safety system as it exists now. So as we combine the quantitative piece, the biggest thing we focus on is the qualitative side of it and do reports. So We don't do just one-off focus group meetings with the public. We don't find that very valuable. What we find valuable and insightful is doing a landscape analysis of the communities that exist in every location. And one of the locations I'll talk about in a little bit is Ithaca, New York, where we're currently working. That's a rather smaller community, but I think we had over 20 different focus groups in that area, identifying vulnerable populations, identifying the right facilitators for those meetings, and engaging in a consistent dialogue with them to understand what their concerns were, what their lived experiences were. And to keep it short, what we'll do is we raise the qualitative piece from people who have been living through generational poverty, experience of proportional policing, with the actual data from the police departments. And then we take the data and we from there we decide and identify the questions that we're trying to solve for. Everyone's in love with solutions and everyone's in love with recommendations. I get rather, I guess I would say cautious. I'll use more careful language right now with people who are so quick to raise solutions because it fits their political agenda. We have to be very careful what we do because we don't want to move so fast where we leave the community behind. This is not it. For example, press releases and reform efforts, if you're doing them and pushing them out to the community, you're framing it wrong and potentially you're centering yourself, whether you're in policing or on the political side. Make sure that you're centering the community and the community is pushing it out with you. In our work in Ithaca, for example, as we start raising these data points, we continuously push the report back to the community for feedback. And then we bring it back to us to do some of the heavy lifting and some of the more technical work. But they were involved in every step of the process. And I will pause too, because also with that is, and part of the community is the police officers. They were also a part of it, and the DA's office and the public defender's office and all the other behavioral health staff and social services. So those are all community members as well. And so we raise their voices and make sure that they have a voice and an input in the decisions that we make. I might for time just skip this section because I want to allow some time for some Q&A. But I want to get into the process. So we lead with data. Importantly, we amplify the voice and needs of the most vulnerable community. When we do these types of analyses, we control for crime and other variables that would affect outcomes that would point to disparities in police data. And after we control for those, we generally present law enforcement the results. And generally we see disparities with use of force, and use of force being used generally 2 times to 4 times more often on Black people than on white people in most areas that we encounter. And so the question then becomes why, right? And that's when we do the deeper dive to figure out if there's other variables attributing that can be attributed to that or controlled for. Next is like we leverage data and data-driven solutions to address and treat problems. This is not something we do lightly. This is a very methodical process. And the last thing we do is we measure and look at the behavioral science. So for example, I think everyone here is probably familiar with CompStat. I've been to more CompStat meetings than I care to admit, and unfortunately, most of the time I'm left wanting because I see crime numbers being presented, but I don't see justice being measured. And justice is something that is always lacking from the conversation. They can tell us how many cars were broken into, but they can't tell us how we're measuring justice. And when you also factor in how we're doing with the community, how just we are being with our practices, how equitable we're being with our practices, and you layer that over the regular CompStat numbers that we're all familiar with, you start to see a more accurate picture. This gets into a whole other topic of like making sure that the dashboards for the public are translated in such a way where it makes sense, right? And same thing with the police. There has to be that translator to say, all right, what do we do with all this data and what can it inform and what can it tell us? And we try to have basically translators at our organization that allow this to go more smoothly. Computer's not working. Let me see if I get to the, here we go. So there's a lot here. I don't think I want to go over it because of time. I think we wanted to keep it to 15 minutes. But when we think about creating a system and redesigning a public safety system, we have to think about what the police's role is. And this is interesting because there's not a one size fits all. And so many of the people requesting our support want this template. It's kind of the, forgive the language, but it's almost like the lazy way of going about it. LA is very unique, for example. So I can't offer like a cookie cutter template for that. But what the community and police officers and council really need to understand is what the role and definition of police officers should be moving forward. And what I mean by that is when you have mismatched expectations of what the police should be doing, you have frustration and disappointment. And sometimes it's not fair for the police officers because they were told and given this instruction, and also same for the community who they had a different understanding of what the police should be doing. And so if your 911 system, for example, can only dispatch police officers or firefighters, we are missing an area where there is going to be a tremendous amount of value of healing certain communities. And I can envision a world where you could call 911, for example, or someone who's experienced schizophrenia. They don't need to be, you don't need to send them a police officer with a gun. They need a different type of professional resource, and a different way of looking at it. And this might seem small, but it takes a lot of, I think, courage to, for example, let me just put this in the policing context. Many police leaders are more comfortable failing conventionally with what has been tried before, in other words, versus trying something new and tracking it and understanding if it's causing a benefit for the communities that we're concerned with healing. And so with those variety of professionals that we can dispatch in the communities, what we can see is a reduction of the footprint of law enforcement. We have overused law enforcement, and there are many opportunities where we can heal the community by just taking them out of certain calls for service that they don't need to be in, and making sure that they are supported and have the support locally and with the community for the calls where we do need them. I wanted to give one example of where we're working at. And this is in Ithaca, New York. So we went through a long process with them. A lot of it had to do with the community, engaging local university support to many, many sessions of working with different groups within Ithaca, New York and Thompson County. And it's been wonderful to work with, and the mayor's been wonderful as well in leading this effort. So one thing that we did after we raised that qualitative and quantitative data is it pointed to a very clear direction that the city wanted something different from their law enforcement. They didn't want an over-militarized police department. They didn't want police officers going to schools and speaking with and lecturing kids for more administrative things and presenting the stigma that the kids are somehow criminal as they have to interact with the police. But they also, which was interesting too, even the people that were more on the abolitionist side and defund side, after having a consistent dialogue with them, all of them recognized after several meetings that they wanted the police and that they needed the police. So in other words, if you're looking to, as we should, transition to a model of policing and public safety that encompasses social services and behavioral health with incentives and cultures that align with those type of values. We see in this process in Ithaca that the community members still need 911 now. There are people still calling 911. So if you dismantle the system, being a dangerous environment that will lead to violence. If you try to cut officers, for example, as I have seen and pushed back on with agencies that we have worked with, that they're suggesting like defunding police by 50%, for example. If there's not another system in place, I find that rather irresponsible. And the majority of the people that are talking about cutting are the officers who are diverse, and progressive, and want change. And there's a tremendous risk there that the people who are calling 911 won't have that service available to them that they need, and that we should, as responsible members of society, provide for them. It doesn't mean, though, that at the same time we can't build up a system that provides more equitable and better outcomes for the vulnerable community and for all those that we are charged with protecting and serving. I do see in the committees that are represented today, I think it's structured more traditionally, and it's something that can be evaluated, right, of what areas fall under your authority, and if there needs to be an evaluation analysis to see if other entities like social services or behavioral health or those types of things should be included under the umbrella of policy reform and change there. In Ithaca, what the ultimate conclusion was is the mayor decided to disband the police department and place it with a public safety department. We were calling it the Department of Community Solutions and Public Health. It's changed a few times, but right now we're in the process of doing the deeper dive analytics, and we'll be doing the implementation process later. But essentially, to keep it simple, it'll be staff with armed officers and also unarmed officers. And some of those job descriptions we'll have to create from scratch, who will respond to the community with calls for service that is mutually agreed upon, that is safe for those individual employees with that skill set to respond to and handle. And what we anticipate in the next few months is coming up to some solid analysis and cost-benefit analysis of how much this will not only cost, but also the projected savings, but also the health improvements and the quality of life improvements that we expect to see from this. Once we get there, we look forward to presenting on those results about how well we are doing in the process, and if certain things need to be changed or modified as we move forward and tweet. Because this is not, as I mentioned in the very beginning, tie it back, we're not trying to run a race to get through the finish line and present a recommendation. With the community at every step of the way, we want their input, and we want them to give us feedback to understand if things need to be tweaked within their community. Because if we're not seeing the positive change and statistically significant change, we want to make sure that we understand which variables are contributing to other variables, so we can make sure that whatever we leave with Ithaca is optimal for that area to produce the best outcomes possible. But that'll be an ongoing effort as things change. We get to my last slide. And I think, yes, I think I am coming up on time, so let me just be real brief here. I'll just say that real change requires time, and quick fixes are not going to get there. So the community wants a reduction of police footprints in their communities, but what I have heard from many communities that they do not want them gone, and also that it would be irresponsible to do that. So, for example, if you move too fast and you're so concerned with intensity, we're not going to be able to drive the outcomes that's going to lead us to what we're looking for. It's about being consistent and garnering trust and excellence through this process. If you don't have trust, you're going to have a report that lacks legitimacy, and the community is not going to have buy-in. And you might as well, you just wasted your time. To be frank, if the community doesn't have buy-in to the report that you're doing, it's just going to get pushed back, unfortunately. So the last thing is just opening up to Q&A. By working with communities, we can achieve better outcomes. And so, to be clear, what I'm saying, this is not just a policing issue. This is an issue that requires structural change that is worthy of this moment. And it's going to take courage, and it's going to take commitment, and it's going to take consistency. And it's going to take people not demanding compliance with policies, but actually garnering commitment. And if they can garner commitment, I think we have a really optimistic chance of sustaining this change that we're all seeking. So I'll end it there, and I think apologies for going over a little bit. So.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Young. I think much of what you talked about kind of really overlays very nicely with much of what Akilah was even talking about in terms of the coordinated response and the sharing of data. For example, when you talked about CompStat, for example, and how you overlay that with information to see how justice is being measured. But more importantly, about how we're distributing those resources in response to these areas. How are we making sure that the services are aligned to what the need is? And it's a much broader, comprehensive dialogue that is not fully captured in a CompStat report. And that's much of what we were talking about, even with Akilah's presentation, is the lack of, and I want to thank you for first starting with, and the reminder that there's no finish line, that reform is a continuum. I think that's a really important conversation because we can celebrate our heyday of all that we've accomplished. And I think that's great. I think that's not, that's nothing to balk at, but it's this reminder that we should just rest on our laurels, I think is a false promise to the community, to members of law enforcement, to the entire city. I think that's the obligation that we have, is continue to be better, and to our cities have evolved, our challenges has evolved, and through that evolution we must change and work within that as well. So I want to thank you for that acknowledgement. When you talked about the overlay of the data points that you mentioned in terms of CompStat and how has there been an adaptation of how those reports have started to align? Have we seen a version of what that looks like?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the answer is yes. When we look at the majority of police systems right now, data systems, you see a lot of antiquated systems, really messy data. Pulling that information out takes some technical talent. But you're right, the technology does exist, and we're grateful for our donors and many of the people that were previously mentioned who donate and support us from a technological perspective, because it allows us to overlay and understand the injustices in many occasions that are occurring in these micro locations. Because police leaders, they need to know that, and there needs to be accountability for their officers' actions. And while we're not here to try to call any one person racist, but when we look at data in aggregate, we see clear themes emerge that there are clear disparities in the data. So we have to ask ourselves why. And generally what we see is that there is a lack of measuring behavior. And some agencies do better than others, absolutely. And some have even put in place proactive accountability measures to understand if officers are getting more complaints than they would expect. It would flag them, right? So they shouldn't be on the street. One of the worst examples I've seen of this recently is with the George Floyd murder, right? With the officer with was like 13 or 14 complaints as a field training officer. The technology exists, to your point, to identify and hold people accountable, but also for the community to be transparent about what the data is suggesting, and going through, not in a demeaning way, but to walk through the data with them to help explain what it means, so they have a public-facing dashboard that actually makes sense, and friends at the PD. In other words, you kind of take down this metaphorical wall that exists within law enforcement and the culture of protecting your brothers and sisters in blue. This is about not winning for ourselves. This is about winning for others. And too often, become emotional, but too many people just have suffered too much. And it's because, and many times it's the officers with even good intentions in systems that don't allow for fair and equitable treatment of community members. And so there are things we could do to put in place that will just flag those areas for the police leaders and executives to keep an eye on it. And so they can prevent it from happening in the first place. So in other words, don't introduce an officer when they're not necessary, or they don't need to be there. And so I think that's a very valid point. I guess I would be clear too of what I'm saying is that this is not just a policing issue. And if all of our solutions are just around the police, we have unequivocally missed the moment here. This has to be an effort of, because there's disparities in social services and behavioral health. So that all needs to be taken into account. And the more data sets we have to layer it, to your point, I think will benefit the community in such a fast and meaningful way that it will create an increased trust faster than I think any other form of or mechanism at this point. And so I think we need to spend a lot more time investing and having conversations around that in the very near term. And policies to support it too, I'll add.
Thank you. I know Mr. O'Farrell had a quick question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Young. Yeah, quick question. I'm very, very intrigued and interested in the whole question of justice being measured, right? I think that was such a great point you made. Now, we have our own Office of Racial Equity that we established in 2021, and Capri Maddox, and perhaps you sat down with her. Just wondering if there is a tool or a template that exists to measure justice outcomes, and if that's something that our Office of Racial Equity could work with your organization to explore.
I love the question. And the answer is we would work to develop probably a very unique tool for your area that would be able to measure exactly what you're trying to solve for. And so I don't want to just get ahead to assume I know exactly the problems that exist in particular cities and communities within the LA area. We would customize it so well where there's a landscape analysis of the community and their needs. And then with that, we would understand what justice looks like and build a tool that would allow the data just to be fed into it. And then it'll learn. So it makes it, it just makes it so much easier for us. As humans, we can't retain all this information that we hear. And so the tool will to your point, enable you to track the justice and how well you're doing. So you could, give yourself a grade or a dashboard even. In one area that I worked with, they wanted to get themselves grades. So they could see every day how they're doing. Green, they knew they were having a good day, right? If they saw some flags, it allowed them and alerted them to direct it to the people responsible for those types or their supervisors to make sure that it doesn't become a problem. It's about being proactive, right? And the same thing with justice, because this is my passion, so I have to throw it out there, is with the children. And this goes back to the adverse childhood scores. I mean, many of these children, we know who they are, who are at risk of needing either county services, city services, or have a high probability of ending up in juvenile hall. And we could get ahead and make sure that the system and their needs are met in a much more proactive manner. And to me, that is also part of justice. So I think your point is dead on. I would just say we would sit down for quite a while actually to design something that is very customized to your area to make sure that we are doing good. I'm quite conscious of not creating harm in communities, but just because I know it works somewhere else. I want to make sure and do pilots and multiple pilots to build up the statistical rigor and power to understand that I'm confident to roll it out more broadly to the LA city and pilot in certain areas, make sure that it's effective and it's doing what we hoped it would do.
I think it's a very worthy endeavor, and I think we should just really keep focusing in on that question. Can justice be measured? So thank you I appreciate it.
And it can. I think there's room to be optimistic here.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bonner?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate the conversation, Mr. Young. I had two related questions, and they go to, you started off with early on in the presentation with the idea of participatory, a participatory ecosystem. And there was some discussion also about the current LAPD approach to engaging with the community, which is somewhat robust, but I'm wanting to get a little more focused on the question of how communities can integrate in a way so that they co-own outcomes. That was part of, I think, something you were implied. So the question really is around, one is, what you're finding in regards to the community's capacity to actually inform and engage in making decisions and policing strategies. Because I'm drawing a distinction between reaching out to organizations like, the ACLU or to your organization or others, versus really engaging with people in the community who are living and breathing some of the challenges. And on a related point, there's the idea that you can't really fight feelings with facts. And so what I'm referring to there, of course, is that many of the challenges around the level of trust in police and policing is, rooted in many, many years of a combination of personal experience, anecdotes, shared experiences, and things of that nature. So also, what are you finding in terms of the community's interest in data on the one hand, versus really what the data represents? So if you go to South LA, I don't think you really need to bring up, some spreadsheets and data and a lot of data to convince people that, that people of color are stopped at greater rates than white citizens. So I'm just making the question of how much interest do you find that people in the communities really have in data versus what it represents, and then how do they work with that data to really actually, participate in decision making?
So that's rather like PhD level conversation you're having, because I do believe that feelings, which translate to experiences, do turn into evidence, because that's what they have experienced. When I was in law enforcement, for example, I would often testify with my training experience as a police officer for X amount of years, because it's about what I experienced as a police officer, and it kind of led to my credibility of I've experienced certain things and patterns, and it gives me some expertise in this area. Well, the community, they've also been experiencing things their entire lives, and I think that is a very strong qualitative evidence. And I often hear people discount it. As the evidence-based policing guy, and I'm the co-founder of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, because we kept hearing your question. Cops looking at 50-page academic journals talking about people's lived experiences, and they don't know how to translate it, right? And so we wanted to bridge that gap from academics and empirical knowledge to how it works for the frontline cops. And with that comes understanding of what the history of the communities that they're working in, the people, their experiences. And what we hear right now is that the community is exhausted, especially the Black and brown community. They are absolutely exhausted, and they're so tired of politicians and others telling them that they have another report for them. And so I hate to keep going over this, but what we emphasize is that once we do a scan of those communities and raise those voices, we do another scan and say, all right, who in the community actually knows who these people are, right? And so we found people who are formerly incarcerated, and they would find people who are unhoused that need to be part of the conversation. And those anecdotes or those feelings are also part of the story. And so we do a whole comprehensive qualitative report that is a companion to the quantitative data that we raise to the recommendations table to have a discussion on. But we just don't leave it behind our walls. We actually push it out to the community again and say, is this what we heard? Did we hear you correctly? Because if you're doing it as a one-off, it's almost disingenuous. And I don't mean that police or politicians are trying to be disingenuous. I mean, they're trying their best. They just don't know sometimes that, oh man, there is a better way of going about this. And that is being genuine. Because if you're going out and doing presentations to the public and you got your police logo on there with your social media tag, it's almost like you're doing it for yourself and pass on it back to your organization how great you're doing. You should be there to be giving, right? It's not about you, it's about what the community needs. How can you give back? And part of giving back is this listening and learning and raising those feelings and facts that those communities have, what they feel they've been disinvested in, where the money is going, and putting that all together. Because once you start putting all these pieces of the puzzle together, what I say this is a PhD level question, is there is so many pieces of the puzzle that need to come together. And I think about this stuff all day long, and it just gets more complex and more complex. And I love that about it because it tells me that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to do good and decenter ourselves and center in the community. Let's start with that. We have to remind ourselves, because I think naturally people tend to focus on themselves instead of themselves. If we center on the communities, I believe we'll have a better chance of producing outcomes that are more equitable.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would just comment, one reason I think it's important is because in many cases there's a perception that the community lacks the capacity to actually engage in meaningful decision making, and that looks different. The way that we all here might engage in the decision making may look different than the way someone in the community might actually respond to that when you go back the second time and provide more feedback and so on. So I just want to make sure that we don't underestimate the community's capacity to actually help work through the current problems that we're discussing today.
I won't name the agency, but they went out into some focus groups at 2:00 one day, and I'm like, okay, well, the single Black mom who's working right now, 2 jobs, how is she supposed to be there? And it's kind of like, oh yeah, you're right. And that's where we need leaders like you guys just to remind and drive that vision of centering the communities and where they're at in life, to make sure that your meetings are happening at the right time and not just on the internet, because people don't have the internet, right? So they're at local forums as well. So thank you. It's a very good question that we need many more conversations about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if we had any other, trying to see if there are any other hands raised. I think we're good. Ms. Calanche, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman Rodriguez. Really quick, you mentioned, Mr. Young, that we shouldn't introduce a police officer if we don't have to, right? Something to that effect, which I understand the premise. In doing some ride-alongs, one of the things that I found was that people, because there isn't another system or infrastructure, people tend to call the police for just about everything and anything, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I went on one ride-along. We went to the same house 3 times, and it was mostly a dispute between parent and a son, who they wanted him to leave and he wouldn't leave. And the girl, it was more of a family issue. which sometimes can escalate into violence, right?
Sure.
Unfortunately. So I'm wondering what and it's a use, I don't think it's the best use of our LAPD resources to have to continue to respond to those types of calls. So I'm wondering if there are examples of other cities besides that wouldn't necessarily be a mental health call, but if there's other alternatives for thinking about training folks to call for assistance that doesn't involve 3 patrol cars and 6 officers. Right?
Yeah. And I appreciate the question. This is something that we are we're heavily involved in. It's complex, but what we do is we try to isolate certain calls and then isolate them anymore to figure out which ones cops need to go to because there's a potential for violence. Which ones could be done through other means, right? Other social services, for example, or maybe it's a housing issue, to your point, or maybe it's a family therapist or someone who needs wraparound services, right? You're absolutely right. So it's about going about it in a very balanced and responsible way. The problem is that when you only have one option, it's like the doctor who only has one type of prescription to give you. you know? It's like, well, you came here, you get this prescription. And it's like, our society is much more complex than that. LA is much more complex than that. And it demands a different type of level of service. And so you're absolutely right. It takes quite a bit to truly understand it, because I don't want too nerdy on you, but when you get to the data systems, sometimes the systems don't adequately tell you what kind of call for service it is. So you have to like build a code and to find out, all right, was this a behavioral health issue or a substance abuse issue, you know? But once you understand that, you get a really interesting picture. So just to give you some perspective, I think the average is about 2 to 4% of calls for service are violent in nature for law enforcement agencies across the country. I went to school at Cambridge in England, and the crime is a little bit different out there, but is you know, pretty much the same as well. I mean, there's similarities, I would say, with the data from the US and the UK model. But then the vast majority of calls that go into 911 are not even like criminal in nature. It's just, they could be directed elsewhere. They're more just calls that don't need anyone with a badge and a gun. And you think about it from a cost perspective, you're spending a lot of money and a well-trained officer going to a call, disputing someone's tree hanging over someone else's fence. And you're thinking to yourself, how in the world, and this is a call that I went on, did I get here with all this training to talk to someone about their tree growing up? So you get my point. There is so much opportunity here. And I get the resistance because it's new, but the structure needs to be redesigned. Our system doesn't operate as a system. It operates as individual silos. And the first step to that, to your point, is understanding which calls can be redirected to a more appropriate resource.
But are there examples of other localities that have such a system that we can look at?
Yeah, I would say we're doing that with Ithaca right now. So I hate naming things because there's good and bads about them, but I will throw one out there that I do like quite a bit, and there's different variations and hybrids of this, but it's the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, where it's kind of a co-responder model. There is a ton of good about it. There's some things that I would love to be tweaked, but this is where I always get into sustaining interventions that are working well, and the things that aren't working well based on your jurisdiction is continuously tracking the data, building in the scientific rigor around it so you know if it's causing the effect that you wanted to have. So one of the positive things about the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, right, that has been used throughout the United States, is that it offers a different alternative where people could get and heal, where they don't need someone who is either going to take them to jail or not take them to jail, right? They need someone who's going to be able to speak with them, get them medication or get them housing or whatever they may need. And so I would point to that one if I had to name one, but I will also caveat I would probably tweak it a little bit as well.
I was gonna ask what you thought about like a gang interventionist. I mean, when I grew up in my neighborhood, and unfortunately we didn't call the police to resolve kind of smaller type disputes. Like there was people in our community that were seen as the problem solvers or that were respected in the neighborhood, and that went and helped, you know, neighbors kind of resolve their issues. So I know that there's an opportunity to build community capacity to address some of these issues and create like a community-based, you know, safety, you know, model. So I'm wondering, like for the call that I went on, like I would totally see an interventionist come and try to talk to the son and say like, hey, you know, why don't you just go somewhere else, come back tomorrow, unless there was some safety issue, right? Which at that moment, the 3 times, there was no safety issue. It was just like, we have to respond because there was a call that was made, right?
Yeah. So there's a ton of, you know, liabilities with that. I absolutely get what you're saying. I think there is a ton of room to be creative in this space to make sure that is properly addressed. But there's also the concern too of making sure that protection is also guaranteed to those people who are placed in harm's way where there could be violence. And so, you know, and I'm not going to get into it now, but you know, some of the procedural justice training and things like that, which the chief is well aware of, and de-escalation tactics, those are critical as you not just train your officers, but you bring the community into those trainings as well, so they know how to interact and they go through the scenarios too and understand what it means to be procedurally just and de-escalation. And so there is this relationship being built, there's trust being built, and it's a gradual process. LA is very unique to me because with Rodney King to the crime spike in the 90s, you guys have been through heck, I will say, and you guys were able to increase legitimacy for a while, which tells me that this is not a unrealistic goal to increase legitimacy within LA. I'm actually quite optimistic that you can do it because you've done it before. And this is just another example I think you're bringing up of an area where we could improve the trust between the police and the community. It has to involve people outside the police as well. Training is not my favorite mechanism because everyone always defaults to training. There's much more to it than training, but there are some wonderful trainings out there that will allow officers to de-escalate things where maybe in the past when my dad was a cop, they just would have resulted in more or less taking them to jail and in a fight. And we're becoming much more sophisticated as a profession. And so I appreciate the question. And I do hope that that leads ultimately to an increase in an understanding of the role of police officers have in particular communities.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Young. I think you captured it perfectly. We've been through heck. So thank you for that. But no, I'm optimistic about the next steps. And I think you've clearly outlined in terms of the layering of what we have. I think we have all the right tenets of what we need. It's about the coordination. It's about breaking down those silos. And it's why we're actually convening this meeting as a combined body today. Because I didn't want our conversations to be happening in absence of one another. These are two bodies that serve specific purposes and oversight with respect to public safety in this city. And so I want to thank our police commissioners. I want to thank Chief Moore, and I want to thank my colleagues on the Public Safety Committee for making themselves available for this meeting today. I think it's it's an effort to help break down those silos, to engage in similar conversations, because when we have these policy-making moments before us, and they can be as simple as some of our community-based strategies, that we're asking the questions of how are we better integrating these services in a manner that engenders the outcomes that we desire with respect to improved public safety, better coordinated approaches, less reliance, if possible, on police officers to do the works that others perhaps would be better suited to provide. And so that was the intent, and I think your contribution and Mr. Sherrill's, I thought just really helped to identify areas where I think we were all better poised to start thinking about and asking questions. And so for that, I want to thank you for your time and your presentation today. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. And pleasure meeting everybody. I hope we can get past this Zoom one day and actually meet in person. Likewise. And so with that, colleagues, again, my incredible gratitude to all of you for making yourselves available today. I thought it was very productive and insightful. And so I want to thank you all for your participation, for your questions, and I look forward to our continued work in helping to help continue to make progress and make Los Angeles a safer city. So I thank you all very much. Our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.